The high water mark, how Trajan pushed Rome to the edge of the world. Part 1. The edge of the world. An old man stands at the edge of the world. The wind from the Persian Gulf blows hot across his face, thick with the scent of salt and the unknown. Out on the horizon, ships are readying to sail east, toward India, perhaps even beyond. Merchant vessels with painted eyes on their prows, their holds promising silks and spices from lands Rome has never touched. He watches them with the same longing that once drove him across continents, the same hunger that pushed legions through mountain passes and across frozen rivers. But time has caught him. The body that once rode at the head of 30 legions now trembles with fever. The mind that planned the conquest of kingdoms now struggles to focus on the dancing horizon. The man is the Emperor of Rome, Trajan, Optimus Princeps, the best ruler. Around him, staff officers wait at a respectful distance, their faces tight with worry they dare not voice. The imperial physicians exchange glances. Everyone can see it. The conqueror of Dacia, the master of the known world, is dying. For one brief, blinding moment in history, the Roman eagle's wings spanned from the mists of Scotland to the burning sands of Babylon. The Mediterranean was a Roman lake, Mare Nostrum, our sea, and every coast that touched it belonged to the Senate and people of Rome. The frontiers brushed against 3 continents. In Britannia, legionaries shivered in stone forts along Hadrian's future wall. In Africa, they patrolled desert roads where caravans brought gold from kingdoms whose names Rome barely knew. In Asia, they stood guard over the ruins of Babylon itself, where Alexander had died 8 centuries before. Never again would Rome rule so much, so far, so confidently. The empire at this moment spans roughly 5 million square kilometers. 60 million people call themselves subjects of Rome. From the wine-dark Aegean to the grey Atlantic, from the Rhine's cold current to the Nile's annual flood, a single law governs, a single currency trades, a single language, Latin, carries the voice of civilization. Roads stretch like veins across the body of the world, 50,000 miles of paved stone connecting city to city, legion to legion. Aqueducts march across valleys on arches that seem to defy gravity itself. In every province, in every conquered land, Roman engineering has written its signature in stone and concrete. And yet, the old man stands silently at the water's edge, aware of the irony. He has reached the edge of the known world, but the body that carried him here is faltering. Behind him stretches the greatest conquest in Roman history, Armenia, Mesopotamia, Assyria itself, all bearing the purple of Rome. His empire, glittering and immense, groans under its own weight. The legions are stretched thin across impossible distances. Supply lines fracture in the desert heat. Jewish revolts flare across the eastern provinces like brush fires. The ships vanish into the distance, and with them drifts the dream of a world without frontiers. Trajan closes his eyes. He remembers the Rhine, that great river that had marked the boundary between civilization and barbarism for as long as Rome had eyes to look north. The Danube, even mightier, where he had thrown his bridge of stone and declared that nature itself must bow to Roman will. The smell of iron and pine, the rhythm of marching feet, the steady, inexorable tramp of hobnailed boots on stone roads, the sound that meant Rome was coming. He was not born to majesty. He was not a prince, not a god in a toga, not one of the old families whose names stretched back to Romulus. He was a soldier from Spain, an ordinary man forged into something extraordinary by discipline, courage, and ambition. His father had been a soldier too, a general under Vespasian during the civil wars. Young Marcus Ulpius Traianus had grown up in military camps, had learned to read on campaign, had mastered Greek while his father besieged cities in the east. He knew the weight of a gladius in his hand before he knew the weight of a toga on his shoulders. He had commanded his first cohort at 25, his first legion at 30. He had built roads through Germania, fortresses along the Danube, had spent more nights under leather tents than under painted ceilings. Rome would call him Optimus Princeps, the best of rulers, the model emperor. Later rulers would pray to match his virtue, would swear the same oath before the Senate. Felicior Augusto, Melior Traiano. May I be luckier than Augustus, better than Trajan. For 3 centuries after his death, that prayer would echo in marble halls. Even the Christians who despised the old gods would admit that under Trajan, Rome had touched something close to earthly perfection. But greatness is never simple. It starts in fear, in chaos, in the crisis of a world looking for stability. It starts in blood and uncertainty, in the moment when everything might collapse. And for Trajan, it began on a rainy morning in Germania, when a messenger arrived with news that the Emperor Domitian was dead, murdered in his own palace, and Rome was tearing itself apart once more. Part 2. The Crisis of Succession. Rome trembled in the shadow of tyranny. The death of Domitian had left a hole where certainty used to be. For 15 years, the emperor had ruled with increasing paranoia, seeing conspiracy in every shadow, treason in every whisper. The Senate had learned to keep silent. The Praetorian Guard had grown fat on bribes and blood money. And then, on September 18th, 96 CE, in a conspiracy that included his own wife, Domitian was stabbed to death in his bedroom. The tyrant was gone. But what came next? Senators murmured behind closed doors, soldiers glared at each other across parade grounds, and the city's heart kept time with a nervous pulse. Power had passed to Nerva, Marcus Cocceius Nerva, an aged senator, childless and mild, a compromise candidate meant to calm the storm. He was 66 years old, a legal expert, a poet of some skill, a man who had survived decades of imperial service by never making enemies and never taking sides. He was exactly what the Senate wanted: safe, controllable, temporary. But calm rarely lasts in Rome. The Praetorian Guard, having learned to make and unmake emperors, having discovered that the power of the sword trumped the power of law, tore through the streets demanding blood for their slain tyrant. They had loved Domitian, or at least loved his gold. He had doubled their pay, had given them gifts, had understood that loyalty could be purchased. Nerva, by contrast, represented the Senate, the ancient families who despised the Guard as jumped-up thugs with delusions of power. Within months, the crisis came. Casperius Aelianus, prefect of the Guard, marched his men to the palace and demanded that Nerva hand over the conspirators who had killed Domitian. The old emperor refused. The guardsmen seized him, forced him to watch as they dragged the guilty men out and executed them in the streets. Nerva wept with rage and humiliation, but he was powerless. The Senate watched in horror as their emperor became a prisoner in his own palace. In the Senate House, marble echoed with whispering doubt. Who would protect the empire from its own guardians? The Guard had killed Caligula. They had auctioned the empire itself after Pertinax. They were a cancer at the heart of Rome, necessary and deadly. Without them, no emperor could survive. But with them, no emperor was safe. Nerva knew that peace required a sword, and he needed one wielded by hands the army trusted, by a man whose reputation was built on competence rather than politics. Far to the north, on the misty banks of the Rhine, a general commanded the respect of both legion and province. Marcus Ulpius Traianus, Trajan, governor of Germania Superior, consul, soldier, builder. He was 50 years old, in the prime of life, with a military career that stretched back 3 decades. He had fought in Syria, in Spain, along the Danube. He had commanded legions in Germania for years, had built fortifications, had kept the peace, had earned the fierce loyalty of his men, not through bribes, but through shared hardship and fair discipline. He was everything Domitian was not: calm, where the tyrant was paranoid; capable where he was vain; disciplined where he was cruel. The legions respected him. The Senate did not fear him. And most importantly, he had no connection to the deadly politics of the capital. He was an outsider, a provincial, a man whose power came from merit rather than manipulation. In October of 97 CE, barely a year into his troubled reign, Nerva made his move. Before the Senate, in front of witnesses, he performed a ceremony that would change the course of history. He formally adopted Trajan as his son and named him Caesar, heir to the purple. A messenger crossed Europe with a scroll, traveling in relay along the imperial post roads, changing horses at every station, sleeping in the saddle, covering the 1,000 miles from Rome to Germania in just over a week. In it, Nerva declared before gods and men that Trajan was to be his adopted son and co-emperor, with full authority over the armies of the empire. The empire exhaled. The legions along the Rhine roared their approval, hammering their shields in the ancient rhythm of acclamation. In Rome, the Senate voted honors with relief flooding their faces. The Praetorian Guard, presented with a fait accompli and a general who commanded 30 legions, suddenly remembered their duty to the state. For the first time in Rome's history, succession came not by blood, but by merit, not by the accident of birth, but by the deliberate choice of talent. It was a revolutionary moment disguised as tradition, because Romans always preferred their revolutions to look like the restoration of ancient virtue. And Trajan, receiving the news in his headquarters in Colonia Agrippinensis, modern Cologne, did something that told Rome everything it needed to know about its new emperor. He did not rush to Rome in triumph. He did not abandon his post to claim his prize. He stayed on the frontier, completing his duty first, finishing the year's campaign, ensuring that the Rhine defenses were secure, that supplies were arranged for winter, that his successor as governor would have everything needed to maintain the peace. He sent letters instead of parades, gracious letters to the Senate, thanking them for their trust, firm letters to the legions reminding them of their oaths, careful letters to the provinces promising continuity and justice. That single choice, that rejection of immediate gratification in favor of duty completed, told Rome everything it needed to know. The soldier was in command, and discipline had returned. 3 months later, in January of 98 CE, Nerva died. Some said of natural causes, some whispered of a broken heart and wounded pride, but it hardly mattered. The succession was secure. Trajan was emperor, acclaimed by Senate and army alike, and he still had not set foot in Rome. He spent another year on the frontier, touring the Danubian provinces, inspecting fortifications, meeting with governors, learning the empire he now ruled. When he finally entered Rome in 99 CE, he came quietly, without the theatrical triumph that was his right, entering the city on foot, greeting senators by name, showing himself to be first among equals rather than a master among slaves. It was political theater of the highest order, and it worked. The Senate called him Optimus Princeps, the best of princes. Pliny the Younger, speaking before the assembled fathers of Rome, praised him as the ideal ruler, the philosopher-king that Plato had dreamed of, the soldier-statesman that Rome desperately needed. For the first time in a generation, Romans dared to hope that the madness of the Julio-Claudians and the chaos of the civil wars were truly behind them. With that act, the age of the five good emperors began, a miracle of stability in an empire built on the bones of ambition, a golden century where Rome would reach heights of power and prosperity that would never be matched again. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, five rulers spanning nearly 100 years, each chosen for merit, each governing with wisdom, each leaving the empire stronger than they found it. But it all began here, with a soldier who understood that power without discipline is tyranny, and that glory without duty is merely vanity. Part 3. The Golden War. Dacia. Peace, however, was never enough for Rome, or for Trajan. The empire needed more than wise governance and restored dignity. It needed victory. The treasury needed gold. The legions needed purpose. And beyond the Danube, glittering in the mountains like a challenge from the gods themselves, lay Dacia. Dacia was the ancient kingdom of Transylvania and the Carpathian Basin, a land of mountains and forests, of fortified heights and hidden valleys. It was ruled by King Decebalus. Decebalus the Brave, his people called him, a warrior king who had united the Dacian tribes and built an army that had humiliated Rome itself. During Domitian's reign, Decebalus had raided across the Danube, had destroyed Roman legions, had forced the emperor to sue for a humiliating peace. Rome had paid tribute, actual tribute, gold flowing north to barbarians, and Domitian had tried to disguise the defeat as a diplomatic triumph, minting coins that showed Dacian envoys kneeling in submission when everyone knew the truth. The insult festered in Roman pride like an infected wound. Senators who had served on the Danube frontier muttered about the shame. Veterans told stories of ambushes in mountain passes, of legions butchered in the snow. Worse, Dacia gleamed with unimaginable wealth, veins of gold running through rock like the threads of fate itself, silver mines that had enriched the kingdom for centuries. Geographers estimated that Dacian gold production exceeded that of any Roman province. It was a treasure chest just beyond Rome's reach, held by a king who had proven he could bleed Roman legions. To Trajan, Dacia was more than rebellion. It was opportunity wrapped in necessity. The empire's coffers, drained by Domitian's building projects and bribes, were thin. Roman prestige, damaged by years of defeat and accommodation, needed restoration. And Trajan himself, now in his 50s, needed to prove that he was more than a safe pair of hands, more than a caretaker emperor. He needed a war, but not just any war. He needed a victory that would be remembered, that would justify the trust placed in him, that would demonstrate once and for all that merit-based succession could produce results that hereditary rule never could. In the year 101 CE, 3 years into his reign, Trajan made his decision. He gathered the legions, an enormous force, perhaps the largest single army Rome had fielded in decades, 13 legions in total, supplemented by auxiliaries from across the empire, perhaps 150,000 men in all, with their supply trains and engineers, their siege equipment and cavalry wings. It was a statement of intent. Rome was not coming to negotiate. Rome was coming to conquer. The preparations took months. Supply depots were established along the Danube. New roads were cut through the Balkans to speed the movement of troops and supplies. Magazines were filled with grain, with wine, with vinegar and salt and oil, all the mundane necessities that kept an army fed and healthy. Weapons were stockpiled, thousands of gladii, pila, by the tens of thousands, artillery bolts, armor, helmets. The vast industrial output of Roman military logistics applied with methodical precision. And then there was the problem of the Danube itself. The river was one of Europe's greatest natural barriers, wide, swift, treacherous. Armies could cross on pontoon bridges, but those were temporary, vulnerable to weather and enemy action, useless for the sustained logistics of a major campaign. What Trajan needed was something permanent, something that would allow his legions to flow across the frontier like water, that would turn the Danube from a barrier into a highway. From his train of engineers strode Apollodorus of Damascus, architect, engineer, the man who would become one of the great builders of antiquity. Apollodorus had served in the East, had studied the great works of Greece and Persia, had mastered the art of building in stone on a scale that made lesser engineers weep. Together, emperor and architect conceived something unprecedented, a permanent bridge across the Danube, at its widest point, over a kilometer in span, standing on massive stone piers driven deep into the riverbed. The construction took over a year. 20 piers, each 50 meters apart, each requiring cofferdams to be built and pumped dry, foundations laid on bedrock below the river's silt. Wooden arches spanned between them, wide enough for 2 wagons to pass. It was an engineering marvel that would stand for centuries, that Roman historians would list among the wonders of the world. Pliny called it the most audacious work since the gods shaped the earth. Dio Cassius, writing a century later, said that it surpassed all of Trajan's other achievements because it demonstrated that nothing in nature could resist Roman will when backed by Roman engineering. The bridge was more than functional infrastructure. It was psychological warfare. When Decebalus saw it rising from the waters of the Danube, saw Roman legions marching across dry shod while supply wagons rolled behind them, he understood that something fundamental had changed. Rome had conquered the river itself. There would be no safety in mountain fortresses if Rome could supply its armies indefinitely from the south. The war had been lost before the first sword was drawn. But Decebalus was not a man to surrender without blood. He had united the Dacian tribes, had built fortifications in the Carpathian heights, had trained his warriors in Roman tactics, and equipped them with Roman weapons captured or traded from deserters and merchants. His capital, Sarmizegetusa Regia, sat high in the mountains, protected by concentric walls and earthworks, with water supplies and granaries sufficient to withstand years of siege. The legions poured over the bridge like a flood of iron and red. One by one, Dacian fortresses fell, smothered under Roman efficiency. Tapai, where Domitian's legions had been massacred, was taken after a brutal battle. The mountain passes were cleared with casualties that Roman histories minimize, but that must have been severe, fighting in rough terrain against defenders who knew every stone, every trail, every ambush point. Roman discipline and superior logistics gradually wore down Dacian resistance. The first campaign season ended with Decebalus surrounded but defiant. As winter came, he sued for peace, offered to become a client king, to pay tribute, to acknowledge Roman supremacy. Trajan, his supply lines stretched and his legions exhausted, accepted. He returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph, to accept the title Dacicus, conqueror of Dacia, to distribute bonuses to the troops. But everyone knew it was incomplete. Decebalus remained on his throne. The gold remained in his vaults, and within months, the Dacian king broke the peace, began rearming, began raiding across the river again. He had bought time to rebuild, and Trajan had given it to him. It was a mistake the emperor would not repeat. The second campaign, begun in 105 CE, was merciless. Trajan had learned from the First War. This time there would be no negotiation, no client kingdom, no face-saving accommodation. Dacia would be destroyed as a political entity, its people scattered or enslaved, its wealth absorbed into Rome. The gloves were off. The legions returned, larger than before, better supplied, moving with the grim purposefulness of an execution. They bypassed the outer fortresses and drove straight for the heart, Sarmizegetusa Regia itself. The siege was methodical and terrible. Roman artillery pounded the walls day and night. Engineers diverted the water supply. Foraging parties stripped the countryside bare. Inside the fortress, food ran out, then hope. When the Romans finally breached the gates in the summer of 106 CE, they found the city already dying. Fires devoured the wooden structures within the stone walls. The treasury had been hidden or destroyed. Dacian nobles had thrown gold and silver into rivers rather than let Rome take it. As the legions flooded through the streets, Decebalus and his closest followers fled into the forests to the north, hoping to wage guerrilla war, to rally the tribes, to somehow resist. It was futile. Roman cavalry, accompanied by Dacian traitors who knew the land, hunted him through the mountains for weeks. They found him at last, cornered in a ravine with a handful of warriors. When they closed in, he slit his own throat rather than wear Roman chains. A cavalryman severed his head and brought it to Trajan as proof. The war was over. The treasure that poured from Decebalus's hidden vaults, from sites scattered across Dacia, buried in mountain caves, secreted in forest shrines, was beyond calculation. Ancient sources speak of 165 tons of gold and 330 tons of silver, though the numbers strain credulity. What's certain is that it was enough to transform Rome, enough to finance building projects that would occupy the city for years, enough to pay bonuses to every soldier in the legions and still have vast sums left over for public works, enough to literally change the landscape of Italy. The gold flowed back to Rome like molten light, and with it came prisoners by the tens of thousands, Dacian warriors to die in gladiatorial games, women and children to be sold in slave markets, skilled craftsmen to be put to work on Roman building sites. Dacia itself was reorganized as a Roman province, settled with veterans from the legions, with colonists from across the empire. Its gold mines were nationalized, operated by the imperial treasury with slave labor. Within a generation, the Dacian language would begin to fade, Latin would dominate, and the region would become one of Rome's most loyal provinces. Modern Romania still bears the name and speaks a Latin-derived tongue because of Trajan's conquest. Rome exploded in celebration. The triumph lasted 123 days, months of games, gladiatorial contests featuring thousands of Dacian prisoners, mock naval battles, beast hunts, theatrical performances. It was the greatest triumph in Roman history, surpassing even Pompey's eastern conquests. Coins were minted, showing Decebalus kneeling, showing the Danube Bridge, showing the emperor receiving the submission of Dacia. Trajan was hailed as the greatest military mind since Julius Caesar. And yet, the victory was more than military. The Dacian Wars represented something profound about Roman imperial ideology. This was not conquest for its own sake, not the mad ambition of an Alexander or the cruelty of an Attila. This was conquest as administration, war as a tool of state policy, violence in service of a vision of universal order. Rome did not just destroy Dacia, it digested it, transformed it, made it Roman. That was the true genius, the real legacy, not just winning wars, but knowing what to do with the victory. With the wealth of Dacia at his command, Trajan would rebuild Rome itself. The gold of the Carpathians would become marble and concrete, would become aqueducts and forums, would become a civilization carved in stone for all eternity. Part 4. The Archive in Stone. Triumph transformed the capital. For generations, emperors had promised to beautify Rome, to make it worthy of its empire, to create a city that matched in majesty what Rome commanded in power. Augustus had boasted he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Nero had planned a golden palace that would cover half the city. Vespasian had built the Colosseum, Domitian the Great Palace on the Palatine. But Trajan, with the wealth of Dacia flooding the imperial treasury, did something different. Where older emperors raised temples to their own ego, monuments to their own glory, Trajan built an empire that lived in stone and public life. He built not for himself, but for Rome, for its people, its future, its eternal mission. The Forum of Trajan was the architectural heart of the new Rome, the culmination of centuries of civic planning. For centuries, the Roman Forum, the old republican heart of the city, had served as the center of political life. But as Rome grew, as its empire expanded, as its population swelled to over 1 million people, the old Forum became cramped, insufficient, a bottleneck of politics and commerce. Julius Caesar had built a new Forum. Augustus followed. So did Vespasian. But Trajan's Forum would eclipse them all. To build it required moving mountains, literally. The Quirinal Hill jutted into the city center, blocking expansion, limiting space. Apollodorus of Damascus, architect of the Danube Bridge and now master builder of Rome itself, proposed something audacious: cut away the hill entirely, remove millions of cubic meters of earth and rock to create a vast level platform where marble could rise unimpeded by natural terrain. The excavation took years. Thousands of workers, many of them prisoners from the Dacian wars, labored with picks and sledges, with ox carts and wooden scaffolding. They cut away the hill to a depth of over 30 meters in places, creating an artificial plateau in the heart of Rome. The removed earth was used to fill marshland along the Tiber, creating new building sites. It was Roman engineering on a scale that made even jaded Romans gasp. When visitors asked how deep the excavation had been, Trajan could point to the column and say, "That high," because the column's height marked exactly how much hill had been removed. On this blank canvas, Apollodorus built an entire district, a complex so vast and integrated that it functioned almost as a city within the city. The entrance was through a great triple arch, the Arch of Trajan, its facades covered with sculpture depicting the Dacian wars. Beyond lay the Forum proper, a vast rectangular plaza, 200 meters long, surrounded on all sides by marble colonnades. The pavement was multicolored marble imported from quarries across the empire: Egyptian porphyry, Numidian yellow, Greek white, blood-red stone from Asia Minor. Walking across it was like walking across a map of Roman power rendered in stone. Around the edges, statues lined the colonnades, Dacian prisoners carved in colored marble, their expressions a mix of noble suffering and defeated pride. Behind them, in the niches of the colonnade, stood gilded equestrian statues of Rome's greatest generals, a gallery of military glory stretching back to Romulus. This was not just a public square, it was a three-dimensional history lesson, a space where every Roman who entered was reminded of the price of empire and the glory of victory. At the far end rose the Basilica Ulpia, named for Trajan's family. It was the largest basilica ever built in Rome, stretching 170 meters in length, with 5 aisles separated by columns of grey granite, each column a single piece of stone hauled from Egyptian quarries. The interior space was vast enough to hold thousands. Here, courts heard cases, magistrates administered justice, merchants negotiated contracts. It was the beating heart of Roman civil life, the place where law and commerce intertwined under soaring vaults of concrete and marble. Light flooded in through clerestory windows, illuminating scenes painted on the walls. More images of the Dacian wars, of conquered provinces bringing tribute, of Trajan administering justice. The message was clear. Roman power came from law as much as from legions, from order as much as from conquest. The basilica was crowned with bronze statues, with gilded roofs that caught the sun and turned the building into a beacon, visible from across the city. Flanking the basilica were 2 libraries, one for Greek texts, one for Latin. This was revolutionary. Libraries had existed before, but always as private collections, as the hoards of wealthy collectors. Trajan's libraries were public, accessible to any citizen, staffed by trained librarians who could help readers find texts. The collections were vast: histories, poetry, philosophy, scientific treatises, legal codices. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, with pigeonholes for scrolls, with reading desks where scholars could study. Windows were positioned to maximize light while minimizing direct sun that might damage the precious texts. These libraries made a statement about what Rome valued. Military conquest was glorious, but civilization was built on learning, on the accumulated wisdom of centuries. An empire of illiterate soldiers was just another barbarian kingdom. Rome would be different. Rome would preserve and extend knowledge, would make Greek philosophy and Roman law available to all, would ensure that the light of culture never dimmed. But the crown jewel, the structure that would make Trajan immortal, stood between the 2 libraries, the Column of Trajan. 100 Roman feet tall, 40 meters, the column rose in a continuous spiral of Carrara marble, its surface carved with a narrative frieze that wound around its circumference 23 times, climbing from base to summit. The carving contained over 2,600 individual figures, 155 separate scenes depicting the Dacian wars in minute detail. It was not just sculpture, it was cinema frozen in stone, a storytelling medium so sophisticated that scholars still debate how the ancient viewers were meant to read it. The story begins at the bottom, with Roman soldiers preparing for war, packing supplies, loading boats, offering sacrifices to the gods. The detail is astonishing. You can see the individual straps on armor, the grain in wooden planks, the expressions on soldiers' faces. The narrative moves upward in chronological order. Legions crossing the Danube, soldiers building fortifications, cavalry skirmishing with Dacian warriors, sieges of mountain fortresses, diplomatic councils, battlefield medicine, engineering feats. What's remarkable is how much of the column is devoted not to combat, but to work. You see soldiers building roads, felling trees, constructing bridges, harvesting grain. You see engineers surveying terrain, officers planning strategy, medical staff treating wounded. The message is profound. Roman military success came not from bravery alone, but from logistics, from engineering, from the unglamorous work of moving supplies and building infrastructure. War was won by those who could keep armies fed and healthy in the field, who could build a fort in a day, who could span rivers and supply besieged cities indefinitely. The carving itself is a masterpiece of low-relief sculpture. The figures stand out just centimeters from the background, yet the carving creates an illusion of depth through careful manipulation of planes and shadows. Buildings appear to recede into the distance. Crowds seem to contain more people than are actually carved. It's a trick of the eye perfected by artists whose names we'll never know, workshop masters who spent years translating sketches into marble. At the summit, 38 meters above the ground, originally stood a statue of Trajan himself in gilded bronze, visible across Rome. Inside the column, a spiral staircase climbed to a viewing platform at the top, allowing privileged visitors to look out over the city. The base served as Trajan's tomb. After his death, his ashes would be placed in a golden urn within the foundation, making the column both monument and mausoleum. The column was not propaganda in the crude sense. It was not distortion or simplification. It was a blueprint of civilization, a manual for how an empire worked, frozen mid-March. It showed war as neither glorious nor terrible, but as labor, difficult, necessary labor, performed by men who were neither heroes nor villains, but soldiers doing a job. This honesty, this refusal to romanticize or demonize, made it more powerful than any boastful inscription. The column said, "This is how Rome conquered the world, not through destiny or divine favor, but through organization, persistence, and the ability to build." Surrounding the forum were markets, the markets of Trajan, a 6-story complex of shops, offices, and warehouses built into the cut slope of the Quirinal Hill. 150 individual shops on multiple levels, connected by staircases and corridors, selling everything from grain to silk, from wine to exotic animals. It was the world's first shopping mall, a commercial hub where goods from every corner of the empire could be bought and sold. The design was revolutionary. Concrete vaulted ceilings, multiple stories, natural light from windows and skylights, even early forms of billboard advertising on the exterior walls. This was not decadence for its own sake. Trajan poured conquest into community. He understood that empire required not just military force, but economic integration, that provinces needed markets, that commerce bound people together more firmly than fear. The markets of Trajan turned Rome into the commercial heart of the Mediterranean, a place where a merchant from Britannia could trade directly with one from Syria, where prices for grain in Egypt affected bakers in Rome within weeks. And beyond the building programs, beyond the marble and concrete, Trajan instituted reforms that touched millions of lives. The Alimenta was perhaps his most ambitious social program, a state-funded welfare system for poor children across Italy. The program worked like an early form of government bonds. Wealthy landowners received low-interest loans from the imperial treasury, with the interest payments funding stipends for children of poor families. Boys received 16 sesterces per month, girls 12, enough to ensure they didn't starve, enough to give families hope. It was the first state welfare system in the Western world, a kingdom of bread and opportunity underpinned by conquest and concrete. At its height, the Alimenta supported perhaps 5,000 children across Italy. The program recognized something revolutionary, that empire had obligations as well as powers, that Rome's strength came not just from its legions, but from the health and loyalty of its people, that preventing poverty was cheaper and more humane than dealing with its consequences. Trajan also reformed the Roman currency, increased the purity of silver coinage, stabilized prices, and ensured that soldiers were paid promptly. He expanded the grain dole, built new aqueducts to supply Rome's endless thirst for water, improved the port facilities at Ostia to speed the flow of goods into the capital. Under his rule, Rome reached a population of over 1 million, the largest city on Earth, a metropolis that wouldn't be matched in Europe until London in the 19th century. And towering above it all, piercing the Roman sky with its spiral of history, stood the Column of Trajan. 100 feet of marble, coiled with the story of how Rome had reached this height. Soldiers marched eternally upward. Bridges rose, trees fell, fortresses burned, and at the summit, the gilded emperor looked out over a city transformed by his vision. Here stood the imperial ideal made manifest, that glory was not only in victory, but in the order and structure left behind, that an empire was measured not by how much it conquered, but by what it built, that the true test of a ruler was not whether he could win wars, but whether he could turn conquest into civilization, bloodshed into prosperity, chaos into order. Trajan had passed that test. He had taken the gold of Dacia and transformed it into a vision of eternal Rome, a city that would stand as a monument to human achievement long after emperors and empires had turned to dust. When visitors entered the Forum of Trajan, they weren't just seeing buildings. They were seeing an argument made in marble, that Rome deserved its empire because Rome could do things no other power could do, because Rome built while others merely ruled, because Rome made the world better through its dominion. It was a seductive vision. It was also incomplete, because for all the marble, for all the planning, for all the welfare programs and public works, the fundamental reality of empire remained unchanged. It required constant expansion, constant victory, constant influxes of wealth from conquest. The system Trajan had perfected was magnificent, but it was also unsustainable. The Dacian gold wouldn't last forever. And once it ran out, where would Rome turn for the next great prize? The answer lay to the east, shimmering beyond the horizon, rich with the promise of Alexander's dreams and weighted with the burden of Alexander's failures. Part 5. The Alexander Complex. The Parthian War. But the human heart is never still. The map, already vast, seemed to mock its master. Trajan stood in his forum, surrounded by the evidence of his achievements, and felt the restless hunger that drives all great conquerors toward their doom. The Dacian Wars were 10 years past. Rome was rebuilt. The frontiers were secure. By every rational measure, his work was complete. He could have spent his remaining years in comfortable administration, guiding the empire he had enriched, ensuring smooth succession, dying in peace, with his legacy secure. But there is a sickness that afflicts those who succeed too completely. When you have conquered everything within reach, when you have solved every problem that faces you, when your name is spoken with reverence across continents, what is left but the impossible? Trajan was in his 60s, grey at the temples, his joints aching in the morning, his digestion troubled by years of campaign rations. He should have been thinking of retirement, of memoirs, of tending gardens at his villa in the Alban Hills. Instead, he looked east. Beyond the eastern frontier stretched the Parthian Empire, heir to Persia's glory, master of the lands between the Euphrates and the Indus. For centuries, Parthia and Rome had circled each other like rival wolves, fighting occasional wars, negotiating careful treaties, each respecting the other's power while probing for weakness. Armenia sat between them, a buffer kingdom whose throne was contested by both empires, whose kings were appointed and deposed by whoever had the stronger army at the moment. In 113 CE, the Parthian king Osroes crossed a line. He deposed the Armenian king, a Roman client, and installed his own nephew without consulting Rome. It was a calculated insult, a test of whether the aging emperor still had teeth. Trajan's advisors urged caution. Armenia was far away, easily lost, and difficult to hold. Parthia was not Dacia. It was a sophisticated empire with cavalry that had destroyed Roman legions at Carrhae, with deserts that swallowed armies, with cities that had resisted conquest since Alexander's time. But Trajan saw something else when he looked at the maps. He saw Armenia as a door, Mesopotamia as a corridor, and at the end of that corridor, India, the spice trade, the Silk Roads, wealth that would make Dacian gold look like pocket change. He saw himself following in Alexander's footsteps, completing what the Macedonian had begun, uniting East and West under Roman law. The campaign began with meticulous preparation. Trajan had learned from Dacia that wars were won in the planning, not the fighting. He spent a year organizing supply lines, negotiating with client kings, positioning forces. The eastern legions were reinforced. New roads were built through Asia Minor to speed the movement of troops. Supply depots were established in Syria. Ships were contracted to carry grain from Egypt directly to forward bases. In the spring of 114 CE, Trajan marched into Armenia at the head of an army that may have numbered 80,000 men, a massive force by ancient standards, though far smaller than what he had led in Dacia. The Armenian king fled without fighting. The kingdom was annexed outright, turned into a Roman province rather than a client state. It was an ominous sign. Trajan was not interested in diplomatic solutions this time. He wanted conquest, permanent conquest, land that would stay Roman forever. The Parthian king Osroes, watching from Ctesiphon, understood too late that he had miscalculated. He sent envoys offering peace, offering to acknowledge Roman supremacy in Armenia, offering gold. Trajan refused. The emperor's blood was up, the legions were in position, and the die was cast. Rome was going east. The next year, 115 CE, the legions crossed the Euphrates, the ancient boundary between west and east, the line that Alexander had crossed 4 centuries before. The northern regions of Mesopotamia fell with minimal resistance. Local rulers, seeing the legions approach, opened their gates and offered submission. Edessa, Nisibis, Singara, cities whose names echoed with biblical resonance, became Roman almost overnight. Coins were minted proclaiming Mesopotamia brought under the power of the Roman people. Trajan himself, now 62 years old, rode at the head of his army, wearing armor despite the heat, insisting on sharing the hardships of his men. Ancient sources paint a picture of an emperor trying desperately to recapture his youth, to prove that age had not diminished him. He ate the same rations as common soldiers, slept in a simple tent, walked when supply problems meant horses were scarce. His staff worried. The desert heat was brutal. Temperatures that could kill an unprepared man in hours. The water was often brackish. Disease spread through the camps despite the best efforts of medical staff. But the emperor drove himself forward, driven by something deeper than strategy or greed. He was chasing a ghost, the ghost of Alexander, the young god-king who had conquered this same ground at 25 and died at 33. Every historian of the period notes Trajan's obsession with Alexander. He carried a copy of Alexander's campaigns. He visited Alexander's tomb in Alexandria. He compared his roots to Alexander's. He was trying to complete unfinished business, to prove that a Roman, even an old Roman, could match a Macedonian youth. In early 116 CE, the Roman army approached Ctesiphon, the winter capital of the Parthian Empire, sitting on the banks of the Tigris. It was one of the great cities of the ancient world: massive walls, palaces covered in glazed brick, markets that traded goods from China to Africa. The Parthian court had fled, taking the treasury with them, leaving the city defended but leaderless. The siege was brief. Roman artillery pounded the walls, engineers undermined gates, and when resistance collapsed, the legions poured in. For the first time in history, Roman soldiers stood in the heart of the Persian world. They found palaces more magnificent than anything in Rome, libraries filled with texts in languages they couldn't read, temples to gods they didn't recognize. Trajan sat on the Parthian throne, briefly, symbolically, and had coins minted, showing himself as King of Kings, the ancient Persian title. From Ctesiphon, the army pushed south, following the Tigris toward the Persian Gulf. One by one, the cities of ancient Babylonia fell or surrendered. Babylon itself, long abandoned but still sacred. Seleucia, the Greek city founded by one of Alexander's successors. Smaller towns whose names had echoed through the Old Testament. The legions were walking through myth-made geography, conquering lands that featured in Genesis and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And then, in the late summer of 116 CE, Trajan stood on the shore of the Persian Gulf. For the first time in history, the Roman Empire reached the Indian Ocean. On the maps being drawn in marble halls back in Rome, it looked perfect. A unified sea of red stretching from Atlantic to Arabia, from Rhine to Indus. The greatest territorial extent in Roman history. An achievement that would never be surpassed. But perfection is an illusion. Reality was already unraveling behind the glittering facade. Even as Trajan stood on that beach, watching ships that might sail to India, his empire was coming apart. The supply lines, stretched across 900 miles of hostile territory, were fracturing. Convoys were ambushed. Roads were cut. Local governors, who had submitted under the threat of Roman swords, now reconsidered as the legions moved on. In his wake, Trajan had left small garrisons, often just a few hundred men, trying to hold cities of tens of thousands. It was nowhere near enough. More seriously, the Jewish populations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Cyprus had exploded in revolt. The exact causes are disputed. Perhaps religious fervor, perhaps rage at Roman occupation, perhaps coordination by messianic movements. Whatever the reason, Jewish communities across the Eastern Empire rose in simultaneous rebellion. In Cyprus, they allegedly killed 240,000 Greeks and Romans. In Egypt, they destroyed temples, killed officials, disrupted the grain shipments that fed Rome itself. In Cyrenaica, they sacked cities and massacred their inhabitants. The numbers reported by ancient sources are certainly exaggerated. Ancient historians regularly inflated casualty figures, especially for groups they despised, but even if the real numbers were 10% of what was claimed, it was still a catastrophe. Trajan had to detach legions from his main army to deal with the revolts, weakening his forces in Mesopotamia just as Parthian resistance was stiffening, because the Parthians had not collapsed. King Osroes, having fled Ctesiphon, rallied his forces in the Iranian highlands. Parthian cavalry, the cataphracts that had destroyed Crassus at Carrhae, began attacking Roman supply columns. Cities that had surrendered revolted as soon as Roman garrisons moved on. The desert itself became an enemy. Sandstorms that stripped visibility to meters, heat that killed men in their armor, water sources that turned out to be poisoned or dry. Trajan's own health never robust, began to fail. Some sources suggest he suffered a stroke. Others mention persistent fevers, possibly malaria or dysentery. He tried to maintain command, but his staff could see him weakening. The man who had shared soldiers' rations was now barely eating. The emperor who had ridden at the head of his army could barely mount a horse. And so Trajan found himself once again standing on a shore, looking at the horizon, feeling the weight of years and failure. The ships on the Persian Gulf represented everything he had sought: the promise of India, of endless expansion, of a world unified under Roman law. But they might as well have been sailing to the moon. His body was giving out. His empire was in revolt. His conquests, so impressive on maps, were already slipping through Roman fingers like sand. Ancient sources record a poignant moment. Trajan stood watching the merchant ships preparing to sail east, and he said aloud, "I would certainly have crossed over to the Indians too, if I was still young." It was the lament of every conqueror who outlives his strength, the recognition that ambition and our cruel companions that rarely stay in sync. He must have thought of Alexander, who had reached India at 29 and died at 33. His conquests still fresh, his legend unspoiled by the long, slow work of trying to hold what he had taken. Trajan was 63. He had achieved more than any Roman emperor since Augustus. He had doubled the size of the imperial treasury, rebuilt Rome, conquered Dacia, reached the Persian Gulf. And yet, standing on that beach, he knew it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The horizon always recedes before those who chase it. The old man understood at last what younger men never learn: that there are borders no army can cross, the limits of age, of distance, of human will, of what the world will tolerate before it pushes back. Rome had reached its high water mark. The tide was about to turn. Part 6. The Retreat and the Reckoning. The journey home was a nightmare of logistics and loss. Trajan, recognizing that his Mesopotamian conquests were unsustainable, began the retreat in late 116 CE. It was presented as a strategic withdrawal, a consolidation of gains, but everyone knew the truth. Rome was abandoning its eastern provinces because it couldn't hold them. Hadrian, Trajan's cousin and most likely successor, had been left in command of Syria. He watched with a general's eye as the reports came in. Legions withdrawing under constant harassment, supply convoys arriving with half their goods, garrison after garrison surrounded and massacred. The new provinces that had looked so impressive on paper, Mesopotamia, Assyria, Armenia, were bleeding away, lost faster than they had been won. The Jewish revolts continued to rage. In Judea itself, where the wounds of the Great Revolt of 66 to 73 CE had never fully healed, there were stirrings of new resistance. Trajan appointed his best generals to crush the rebellions. Lucius Quietus, a Berber cavalry commander of legendary skill, received the governorship of Judea with orders to pacify it by any means necessary. The suppression was brutal. Cities were depopulated. The surviving Jewish communities would need decades to recover, and the seeds were being planted for the even more catastrophic Bar Kokhba revolt that would erupt under Hadrian. The emperor himself was failing rapidly. By early 117 CE, as he made his way slowly westward through Asia Minor, he could no longer hide his condition. His hands trembled. His speech was slurred. He had probably suffered multiple strokes, and his body was riddled with the infections and ailments that were the price of years of campaign life. The man who had stood on the shores of the Persian Gulf 9 months earlier was now a semi-invalid, carried on a litter, barely able to sign documents. On his journey west, Trajan stopped at various cities: Antioch, where a massive earthquake struck and nearly killed him; Selinus in Cilicia, where his condition worsened dramatically. His wife Plotina, who had accompanied him throughout the eastern campaigns, stayed by his side. She was a remarkable woman, educated, philosophically inclined, influential in court politics, but rarely overtly political. Now she faced a decision that would shape the next decades of Roman history. Trajan had no children. He had never formally adopted an heir, though everyone assumed Hadrian, his cousin, his ward, married to his grandniece, would succeed. But Trajan had never made it official, had never performed the necessary legal ceremony. Perhaps he had always thought there would be more time. Perhaps he enjoyed keeping ambitious subordinates uncertain. Perhaps he simply couldn't face the admission that he was mortal. As August 117 CE approached, in the coastal city of Selinus, the emperor's condition became terminal. What happened next is one of history's enduring mysteries. According to official sources, Trajan summoned his staff and formally adopted Hadrian as his son and heir on August 9, 117 CE. 2 days later, Trajan died, but doubts surfaced immediately. Hadrian was in Antioch, not at Trajan's deathbed. The adoption documents arrived suspiciously quickly. Some whispered that Plotina had forged them, that Trajan had died without naming a successor, that the empress had acted to prevent civil war, and perhaps to protect her own position. Others suggested that Trajan had indeed made Hadrian his heir, but had delayed too long, leaving Plotina to formalize what had only been verbal wishes. We'll never know the truth. What matters is that the army accepted the succession. Hadrian was acclaimed emperor by the Eastern legions, confirmed by the Senate, and took power without significant opposition. The transition, however murky its details, was peaceful, and that was Trajan's final gift to Rome, even if delivered by his wife's intervention rather than his own planning. Trajan's body was cremated, and his ashes returned to Rome in a golden urn. In an unprecedented honor, they were placed within the base of his column, making that monument both celebration and tomb. The Senate voted him divine honors, declared him a god to stand alongside Augustus and the other deified emperors. For centuries, his name would be invoked as the standard of imperial virtue. But Hadrian, pragmatic and clear-eyed, understood immediately what Trajan in his last years had refused to admit. The eastern conquests were untenable. Within months of taking power, Hadrian abandoned Mesopotamia, withdrew from Armenia, surrendered the new provinces. He reinstated the Euphrates as Rome's eastern border, the same line that had existed before Trajan's campaigns. 3 years of conquest, thousands of lives, immense expenditure of blood and treasure, all given up as if they had never happened. It was a bitter admission of reality. The eastern provinces had cost more to garrison than they generated in revenue. The supply lines were too long, the local resistance too fierce, the Parthian threat too persistent. Rome could conquer those lands, but couldn't keep them. Hadrian chose wisdom over pride, consolidation over expansion. He would spend his reign building walls, physical walls, like the Great Stone Barrier across northern Britain, and metaphorical ones, defining and defending Rome's limits rather than extending them. In this, Hadrian was probably wiser than his predecessor. The Parthian campaign had been Trajan's only significant failure, the flaw in an otherwise exemplary career. But it was a revealing flaw. It showed that even the best of emperors could succumb to the siren call of conquest, could confuse expansion with achievement, could chase glory beyond the bounds of strategic sense. Perhaps that was wisdom. Perhaps it was the recognition that empire has natural limits, that not everything can be conquered, that even Rome's reach must eventually stop somewhere. Hadrian would define those boundaries, would shift imperial ideology from expansion to preservation, would make virtue of necessity. But even Hadrian, the cautious architect of boundaries, worshipped Trajan's memory. He kept the column standing, kept the forum intact, maintained the building programs, continued the welfare initiatives. More than that, he enshrined Trajan as the model emperor, the standard against which all successors would be measured. For 3 centuries after his death, that prayer continued. Felicior Augusto, Malia Traiano. May you be luckier than Augustus, better than Trajan. Every emperor heard those words at their accession. Every emperor understood. They were being held to an impossible standard, not just to rule well, but to rule as well as the best ruler Rome had ever known. What made Trajan worthy of such veneration? It wasn't just military success. Plenty of emperors won wars. It wasn't just building programs. Others had beautified Rome. It wasn't even the combination of the two. What set Trajan apart was something more subtle. He had understood what empire was for. To Trajan, empire was not an end in itself, but a means to an end. Conquest was not about glory, but about resources. Resources that could be transformed into stability, prosperity, culture. War was not sport, but policy. Victory was not celebration, but obligation. The obligation to make something lasting from the temporary advantage of military success. The gold of Dacia became the forum, became the alimenta, became roads and aqueducts and libraries. The provinces added to the empire were not just territories on a map, but communities to be integrated, developed, made Roman. Trajan governed as if he were managing a vast estate for future generations, as if his job was not to extract, but to invest, not to dominate, but to build. This vision of empire as stewardship rather than exploitation was not unique to Trajan. Augustus had held similar views, but Trajan executed it with a competence and consistency that Augustus, for all his genius, had never matched. There was a reason Pliny called him Optimus Princeps. It wasn't flattery. It was recognition that in Trajan, the Roman ideal of virtues, excellence, virtue, capability, had found its fullest expression. Of course, we should not romanticize. Trajan was still an autocrat, ruling an empire built on conquest and maintained by force. The Dacian wars killed tens of thousands, enslaved hundreds of thousands more. The Eastern campaigns were based on aggressive imperialism that modern ethics would condemn. The peace Trajan maintained was Roman peace, the peace of overwhelming force and the threat of annihilation for resistance. Yet within that framework, within the brutal reality of ancient empire, Trajan represented the best of what was possible. He did not kill senators for amusement, like Caligula. He did not loot the empire for personal pleasure, like Nero. He did not rule through terror, like Domitian. He was competent, just within the limits of his time, genuinely concerned with the welfare of his subjects and committed to leaving the empire better than he found it. He had made Rome unstoppable and taught it the cost of its own ambition. He was the high watermark, the living edge of empire, the moment when Roman power reached its absolute zenith and could rise no further. After Trajan, emperors would defend, consolidate, manage decline, but none would surpass what he had achieved. The empire would endure for 3 more centuries in the West, 15 in the East, but it would never again feel so confident, so vigorous, so certain of its mission. The Antonine Plague would soon ravage the population. Marcus Aurelius would spend his reign fighting defensive wars rather than wars of conquest. Septimius Severus would militarize the state. Diocletian would divide the empire. Constantine would move the capital east. Slowly, inexorably, the world Trajan had known would fade into memory, into legend, into the stuff of nostalgic histories written by people longing for a golden age they had never experienced. But in that fading, Trajan's achievements became even more significant. When Rome fell, or rather, when the Western Empire finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions and external pressures in the 5th century, people looked back to Trajan's age as the model of what had been lost. Medieval scholars, reading Pliny's panegyric and Dio's histories, saw in Trajan proof that good government was possible, that power could be exercised virtuously, that military might and civil virtue need not be opposites. Renaissance humanists, rediscovering classical texts, held up Trajan as the philosopher King Plato had imagined, the ruler who proved that absolute power need not corrupt absolutely if wielded by the right person with the right values. Machiavelli, writing about principalities and republics, used Trajan as an example of how a new man, not born to power but elevated by merit, could win legitimacy through competence and justice. The column stands to this day in the heart of Rome, its spiral of history still climbing toward the sky. The statue at its summit is no longer Trajan. That was lost centuries ago, but St. Peter, placed there by a Renaissance pope. It's fitting in a way. The conqueror has been replaced by the apostle, pagan Rome by Christian Rome, empire by church. But the column itself remains, still telling its story of soldiers and engineers, of bridges and fortresses, of an empire at the height of its power. And so, in the fading heat of history, Trajan stands forever on that shore. The Persian Gulf spreads before him, glittering with promise and illusion. The sea murmurs ancient secrets about the price of ambition and the limits of will. The horizon gleams like a cruel joke, always there, always receding, always promising that one more step, one more conquest, one more campaign will be enough. Behind him, carved in imperishable stone, the column spirals upward, defying time, defying decay, defying the inevitable entropy that claims all human works. It is still there, 19 centuries later, still telling its story to anyone who cares to climb its stairs and read its spiral text. Stone against sky, memory against forgetting, the dream of Rome carved for all time. That is Trajan's true legacy, not the provinces he won and lost, not the gold that was spent and is gone, not even the buildings that have crumbled or endured. His legacy is an idea, the idea that power can be exercised with wisdom, that conquest can serve construction, that empire at its best is not mere domination, but the organization of the world toward peace, prosperity, and order. It's an idea we still grapple with, still debate, still sometimes believe, and sometimes reject. We live in a world shaped by empires, British, American, Soviet, that have all claimed to be forces for good while exercising overwhelming power. We argue about whether empire can ever be benevolent, whether any amount of roads and aqueducts can justify conquest, whether Trajan was a model ruler or merely an effective imperialist. Perhaps the answer is that he was both. Perhaps the lesson of Trajan is that even the best emperors are still emperors, that even the most virtuous exercise of power is still power, that the high water mark of empire is still a tide that rises and falls, leaving wreckage on the shore. But standing in Rome today, looking up at that column, watching the marble soldiers march eternally upward in their spiral dance of war and work, it's impossible not to feel some echo of what Romans felt when they saw it new. Awe at human capability, wonder at what disciplined effort can achieve, and perhaps a touch of sadness that such achievements are always temporary, always fading, always remembered, but never recreated. The old man stands at the edge of the world. The wind blows, the ships sail east, and Rome, at the height of its power, begins its long, slow, inexorable decline. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. The high water mark has been reached. The tide is turning. And all that remains is to remember and to ask ourselves what we would do differently if we had the chance to stand where Trajan stood, looking out at an empire that spanned the world. Would we push forward, chasing Alexander's ghost into India? Or would we stop, consolidate, build walls and call them wisdom? Would we be satisfied with enough? Or would we always hunger for more? Trajan chose to push forward. It was his greatness and his failure, his glory and his tragedy. And that perhaps is the most human thing about him, that he could not stop, could not be satisfied, could not accept the limits that lesser men acknowledge without struggle. He died reaching for the impossible, and in that reaching, he became immortal. The column stands. The forum endures. The name echoes down the centuries. And we, looking back across the gulf of time, see in Trajan what we want to see: conqueror or administrator, imperialist or benefactor, the best of Rome or the embodiment of empire's fundamental flaw. Perhaps he was all of these things. Perhaps that's what makes him worth remembering. Not that he was perfect, but that he was perfectly human, perfectly flawed, perfectly representative of what we achieve and what we lose when we try to build empires that will last forever. Nothing lasts forever, but some things, some achievements, some visions, some dreams carved in marble, last long enough to matter, long enough to inspire, long enough to warn. Trajan understood that. Standing on the shore of the Persian Gulf, feeling his body fail and his empire strain, he must have understood that everything he had built would one day fall. But he built anyway because that's what humans do. We build against the void, knowing it will claim our works, but refusing to surrender without leaving something behind. The column is what Trajan left behind. 1900 years later, it still stands. And that, in the end, is victory enough for any mortal man, even an emperor who ruled the world. The end.